Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This past week saw the publication of the 11th annual UBS Billionaire Ambitions Report, which once again surveyed UBS Billionaire clients around the world on the unique challenges and opportunities ahead. This year's edition focuses on the forces driving global wealth creation, the increasing role of inheritance, and the evolving ambitions of the world's most influential families. Here to make sense of the findings, we're once again delighted to welcome to the show Maximilian Kunkel, Chief Investment Officer, Global Family and Institutional Wealth at UBS Global Wealth Management. Max, great to have you with us, as ever. I always look forward to this time of year because we get to interrogate the Billionaire Ambitions Report. The 2025 edition, I think, fits into the heritage of the previous pieces. Super interesting. Maybe let's start with the subtitle, The Rise of a New Generation. Why is that the correct title for this iteration of the piece, Max?
Because we're effectively seeing three things playing out here. The first one is that despite all the concerns on the geopolitical and economic front, we've seen 196 entrepreneurs become self-made billionaires last year. And this is from a range of industries. This is the second highest number that we've seen since we actually started collecting the data. The second thing is that we've seen the great wealth transfer that we've also talked about in previous shows is gaining steam. We had 91 heirs becoming billionaires through inheritance. And the third element here is that wealth is increasingly flexible. So we've already seen that 36% of billionaires that we've surveyed say they've relocated at least once. 9% are considering it. And if we look at the next generation, this number rises to about 15%.
Yeah, well, there's so much there to tear into, Max. Let's look at a couple of the key points that you've highlighted there. I think one which I find super interesting is this ever greater internationalism within these kinds of families in particular, but individuals too. As that great wealth transfer accelerates, what does that increasingly international emphasis mean in terms of the work you do ensuring that you're giving the right investment advice? And how does the internationalism also reflect a shift in priorities with some of this billionaire demography?
So what we are generally seeing is that there is an importance in international connectivity, in being mobile, and in particular also focusing on where do I get the best quality of life, the best medical service, the best education for my children, the best state of affairs when it comes to the rule of law, and also, be in a country where one feels comfortable with regards to the overall situation of the debt load at the sovereign level, because that does have implications again on taxation, business matters, personal matters. So that's maybe a starting point. The second point that we are seeing here is that increasingly the next generation is set to take over not only the reins of their own business, but also follow their own visions. And we're seeing that. So when we're asking our billionaire clients, more than 80% say they would like the next generation, not just to take over the reins of the business, but effectively follow their own path. And this is an important difference to what we had in prior years, because in previous years, you would have normally thought, okay, heir takes over the business, serves stability, etc. But in this age of ever greater technological disruption and global competition, we are seeing a shift in mindset there. Now, when it comes to investment, maybe just one thought. When we're thinking about the inheritance, a lot of the inheritance in the first step goes to the spouse, so often women. And here we see two things. First of all, on the investment side, it might sound stereotypical, but it is something that the data is also showing. Women tend to be somewhat more risk averse, and second, somewhat more disciplined when it comes to investment. So there's a much bigger focus on strategic asset allocation, maintaining discipline, and staying the course, rather than significant moves in and out of opportunities.
We'll talk a little bit more about some investment specifics in a moment, but just on these more general points, Max, I find it so interesting, and just to interrogate the data in a bit more detail, a huge majority of billionaires hoping to see their kids pursue their own passions. And you've already kind of alluded to this. And again, a majority wanting their inheritors to make a genuinely positive impact. How much of a challenge is it when the younger generations have these different priorities? And a lot of them are about addressing, the big secular global challenges that we all know are very immediate: climate change, increasing digitalization, and so on. Is that difficult? Because the pace of change in some of those fields is very rapid in terms, again, of providing the best advice. Or actually, are these kinds of interests and priorities shared so widely that actually it's kind of the only conversation in town?
Well, what we certainly do have is there's a lot of focus, not only with this generation, but also others, on technology. But I think what we're increasingly finding here is that it moves beyond just the discussions around AI and the tech space towards how can this actually be used? And how can this be used in order to address some of the major challenges that we have on an environmental and a social level? So, I'll give you an example. There's a significant focus on using technology to increase efficiency when it comes to healthcare related items, say, for example, diagnostics or drug development. And this is something where many of the inheritors are very much engaged in. We're also seeing it when it comes to climate change. I think with regards to lots of focus on renewable energy and renewable sources of energy and how to better use them, given also in part the AI-driven boom in electricity demand that has come about and is likely going to continue.
Let's talk a little bit about some geographies. And I find it interesting that we've had obviously quite a lot of market volatility in this year, to put it mildly. But North America remains a big focus, Max, which I don't know, it might surprise some. And whilst we see interest in, Western Europe, where I'm sitting, or across APAC rising, North America is still really a focus point. I guess this is partly due to maybe, I don't know, performance of North American equities generally. But just talk to us a little bit about where the investment focus is in geographic terms.
Sure. So as you rightly pointed out, North America remains the top destination here. 63% of billionaire clients that we surveyed say they see the greatest opportunity in terms of investments there. And I think this is partly related to a more fundamental thinking, which goes back to what is the biggest challenge that developed nations face? It's a lack of labor. And as a result, companies are investing in productivity enhancing technology. Now, the biggest provider of that technology continues to be the United States. This is something that naturally people think about. What you just indicated, which I thought was so noteworthy versus, say, last year, where it was really all about the United States in terms of where the clients that we surveyed saw the biggest opportunities. And we've seen a very noticeable pickup in terms of Western Europe as well as Greater China, where over the course of the next 12 months, more than a third see the biggest investment opportunities arising. And I think this is in large part due to this powerful mix of what I would consider the three Ps, so policy, profit, and positioning developments. And many clients are seeing here an opportunity over the course of the next 12 months.
Let's talk about some other kind of investment areas. What about some of the shifts we've seen, Max, and what the data tells us about exposure to other kind of asset classes and areas? Increase to PE, which I think was quite striking. Hedge funds, infrastructure seems to be something that's increasingly, part of the discourse. Talk to us a little bit about some of these other areas.
So I think one of the findings that I found interesting, given all the discussions around bubbles or otherwise in US equities and AI and so on and so forth, is the following, that the message here is very clear. The vast majority does not see a bubble that you want to sell out of. Only 7% of billionaire clients we surveyed plan to reduce their exposure to developed market equities, only 2% to emerging market equities. On the contrary, there's a very clear realization that based on a very powerful rate cutting cycle that we've seen over the course of the last 2 years and a strengthening and broadening of global earnings growth, this is a bull market you want to embrace. More than 40% plan to add to equities, both in developed and emerging markets over the course of the next 12 months. Now, as you just pointed out, of course, there's also opportunities arising outside of this space. Private equity noticeable, and in particular, I think direct investment is quite noticeable. Always remember that entrepreneurs that have been so successful tend to be risk takers and tend to be very much focused on areas where they can exercise some control. So there's always been some tendency to look at direct investment opportunities in private equity. Over the last few years, in part because of the changing rates environment, this has taken a bit of a backseat. Now we're seeing that close to 50% are looking to add to private equity direct investments over the course of the next 12 months. Now, if you think about the risks, there's still considerable uncertainty for many when it comes to geopolitics and policy more broadly. What do they do about it? Three things. The first one is, as you alluded to, they're looking to areas such as hedge funds to provide a certain degree of stability. And it probably makes sense given we are in an environment of lower correlations and higher dispersion, so a better playing field for many hedge funds. Second, they're not aggressively selling out of fixed income just yet. We only have, for example, 22% of respondents tell us that they want to reduce their exposure to developed market fixed income. Makes sense. If we did see an economic downturn that was more severe than we and many other foresee, you would see more rate cuts and this area would do particularly well. And then third, they still focus on gold. Remember from our conversation last year when we talked about the report, gold was clearly one of the things the clients had highlighted to us that they want to gain more exposure to. They have. And when we're looking after this very strong run that we've had this year at how many actually want to reduce their exposure, only 3% of the billionaire clients that we surveyed say they are planning to reduce their exposure over the course of the next 12 months.
Max, let's change gear slightly. I want to talk about longevity. Now, this is obviously one of these big secular themes we've discussed often on this program with you and other colleagues across a whole load of areas. And obviously, increasing longevity globally throws up lots of opportunities in some areas, actually, that you've already mentioned, healthcare, elder care, and so forth. But I'm interested in the impact of longevity on the strategic decision-making of this billionaire demography, because I guess as people come to terms with increases in their own longevity, right, how much and to what extent does that reshape their own strategic planning? And I guess this speaks to the rising role of family offices, something you and I have talked about frequently before. What are the big wealth management implications longer term for billionaires increasingly pivoting to recognize their own increasing longevity?
In fact, it's interesting. In fact, actually, when we're asking them, what do you think about your own longevity? There's a significant amount of clients that believe that they are likely going to live longer than they would have expected otherwise, which is in part, of course, due to medical developments, nutrition, and other areas. Now, when it comes to investment management, I think there's two areas really. The first area is, of course, the professionalization that we're starting to increasingly see. And here, the areas of family offices are clearly gaining steam. And the second thing is everything when it comes to the management and the planning of the transfer of wealth over time. So what you're starting to see here is that there's this powerful mix of, on the one hand, plan, act, talk, and do, where you really have to think about what do I want to give to the next generation and how are they going to manage it? And once you have that in place, you are starting to see also more and more of the next generation come through, work together with the parents and the family office in order to shape the portfolios going forward. And there is some change in that.
Perhaps a final thought, Max, and we've talked a little bit about technology as a sector, how critical that is here, driving the growth in numbers of billionaires and of billionaire value, particularly in North America. Just talk to us a little bit, just sector by sector, though, because there are some other interesting trends. If we look at Western Europe, a market we've mentioned already, consumer and retail sector plateauing somewhat, and you've mentioned the growth of Chinese mainstream brands. Lots of growth this year across industrials, for example, I think for self-evident reasons. Talk to me a little bit about just some of those sectoral trends and maybe have let's speculate a little bit on what the direction of travel could be on some of those over the next 12 months.
I think, first of all, what we are continuing to see is growth is relatively broad-based. And this is important because, of course, there is this whole idea that everything that is related to growing wealth has to be to do with some exposure to AI. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the case, as we can see from the data. In fact, as long as you're able to commercialize innovations at scale, create new sources of demand, you don't necessarily even have to be in the AI space to be successful in this day and age. And this is what we've seen. We've seen very, very broad-based range of entrepreneurs come through as first-time billionaires from, the hospitality space towards, as you mentioned, industrials, healthcare, and others. I think that when we're looking ahead, you have two parts. The first one is relatively easy to predict to the extent that one can talk about, something that's easy to predict. And that is that the amount of inheritors is going to only grow. We estimate that for mere demographic reasons, over the course of the next 15 years, we'll see a wealth transfer amongst the billionaire cohort that we track of around 5.9 trillion US dollars. Of course, the predictions around the self-made billionaires is a little bit more difficult. However, I think what's very encouraging is really that in a year like what we've been going through with all of the economic and political uncertainty, you are still seeing close to record amount of new self-made entrepreneur billionaires come through because they are able to commercialize innovations. And I think that leaves me quite hopeful going forward, particularly because the use of technology is really able to address some of these major social, environmental challenges that are yet to be addressed.
Maximilian Kunkel bringing us to the end of this edition of the show here on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and find out more at monocle.com, or discover more and find out how UBS can help you at ubs.com. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.